think I've been doing. Is that business? Does that mean it's serious now?
Yeah, we're on, man. We go. We don't fuck around. We just get on and start recording.
We're live.
Except we throw F-bombs in the first 5 seconds
Yeah.
of the podcast.
Jason threw me a text when I asked him to be on it. He's like, is this a PG podcast or can I throw around some F-bombs?
By all means.
I was like, drop a couple F-bombs if you need to.
I almost F things up because I was doing the 2 hour. I was thinking it was 2 hours later for some reason. So I literally was walking out the door to go work out.
Really?
And I was like, oh shit, it's now. It's 2 hours early.
Oh, thanks for breaking up your workout for us.
Yeah.
Were you gonna go?
You guys going crazy?
Yeah, we're going a little bit crazy, but we have each other at least. We were talking. We've never spent more time on FaceTime with one another. I haven't seen more PT or Res than now in my life.
We're seeing each other more now than we did at the gym.
So you get out of his pajamas and his Crocs?
We were talking about that too.
I was telling Pete that I have to make a conscious effort for like a midday teeth brushing.
I know it's brutal. It's like all it did here was it give people more of a green light to go to the grocery store with their pajamas on.
Yeah.
Like every time I go to the grocery store, it's full of people with disheveled hair. Looks like they haven't brushed their teeth, and they got their fucking pajamas on.
Well, you should say something to them.
It's like your one opportunity to get a shower, get cleaned up, and look appropriate to go out in public.
Still not doing it.
Still not doing it. Oh my God. So J-Mac, where do we start with you? You've got a long bio. I don't have anything written down, but if I'm going off of memory, you started it out athletically as a varsity volleyball player.
Correct.
You can cut me off at any time if you need to interject. Then you got into kickboxing to train for that and decided that it was something you liked and you became a professional UFC fighter.
Yeah, right from kickboxing to UFC,
Well, come on, there's a time lapse there. So I played volleyball my entire childhood, or like through junior high school, and then came to Alberta to play volleyball at Mount Royal College, and then played volleyball there. Had a good run at things. Took criminology, finished up my schooling, and then I realized that I had played team sports my entire life. And as you guys know, you can have the best game of your life and still not be successful in team sports. So I think at that point I was just kind of done with team sports and I wanted to try an individual sport, something that I had never done. So in the last year or two of playing volleyball, the UFC came out, and we would watch the UFC on the bus trips to play different schools, and so it sparked my interest, and so I started taking a jiu-jitsu kind of / wrestling class on Sundays, and eventually that morphed into like a kickboxing class on Wednesdays, and then that slowly morphed into a fighting
professional career. Rez is happy that you took criminology. I saw him light up.
Yeah, I took the same thing. Criminology, the path to CrossFit.
The path to CrossFit. So, and here we both are in the same spot, running affiliates and teaching people how to squat and deadlift.
But when you after you graduated university, though, even before you were a fighter, you got into like a security type job, right?
So, well, during college, I was working, moonlighting as a door guy at a lounge. Some guys from the hockey team, the school hockey team, and I got this job as bouncers at a lounge, a live music lounge, and it was really popular on Sunday and Monday nights, which worked well for us because we played hockey and volleyball on Fridays and Saturdays, and we always were free on Sundays and Mondays. So we were doing that, and then after graduating, I worked for an armored car business for a while. Loomis Armored Cars was kind of like, I transitioned into, I guess, a real job, for lack of a better word, a kind of a 9-to-5 real job. And then eventually took a job with the Correctional Service of Canada at a federal penitentiary about an hour up the highway from Calgary. And I guess that was kind of my first taste of a real job. And I realized very quickly that I didn't like that.
At the time, were you thinking like that could be like a long-term thing, almost like a career?
I think when you're young, I think you feel like you've hit the jackpot initially when you get a job with the federal government where you have a steady paycheck, you have job security, you have a pension. But very quickly you realize where you're just going to rot away working 8-hour shifts in this penitentiary for the rest of your life. And many of the people I worked with had done exactly that, started very young, and they were like getting close to retirement, and they were just like very angry, jaded individuals. So I certainly didn't want that for myself.
Yeah. That's
How old were you back then?
I think that I was like 24, I think, PT. Like literally graduated from college, took a job for a couple of years with Loomis, and then kind of jumped into the correctional service. So I was pretty young, 24, 25.
Cool.
What's sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, and just that was kind of from there, I was obviously with my wife, and we eventually moved to Red Deer, and we started a family. We were young, newly married, and we were starting a young family. And then I went on a parental leave with my wife was in nursing school, and the correctional service would give you 90 or 95, can't remember what it was, like 95% of your salary to stay at home for 6 months with the birth of a child, or 6 months or a year. I can't remember what it was, but my wife was in school, and it just made sense that I would go off on paternity leave. And that was kind of what not kickstarted my fight career per se, but during that time I was able to train full time, and I started taking amateur fights and professional fights, and that was kind of what allowed me to kickstart my fight career.
So you said that just from watching the UFC like early on, that's how you kind of got sparked into wanting to get into the fight world and become a fighter. Like if I watch UFC, that's not what I think. These guys are crazy. Like if I was in the ring right now, I would get pummeled by the smallest guy that goes in there on a nightly basis. Like, were you like a tough kid? You were a bouncer, but like what got you interested in fighting in MMA?
Man, I don't know. No, I wasn't like a kid that was always in trouble. I was playing sports my entire life. I was a kid that was always in the gym playing sports and training and running and lifting weights. I had no time for getting in fights, nor any. Well, everybody probably has that. As a male, you probably always question,
couple tussles.
Could I throw down if I had to? You always question that, but.
Yeah.
But no, I didn't really I wasn't in trouble. I wasn't constantly getting in fights. I think I got in one or two, fights in high school or junior high. So a few details I guess I'm leaving out there as I read Inside the Lion's Den. It was Ken Shamrock was the first guy to set up this fight academy, if you will. He was fighting professionally in Japan, and then he kind of recruited some guys, and his brother Frank Shamrock. They had this club in Lodi, California, like in the middle of nowhere in Northern California. And I read this book, and I was like so intrigued at how he just kind of he handpicked these guys, took them into this place. They built this kind of garage gym, for lack of a better word, and they were just like, he was just training fighters, and they were just throwing down. And they had, in the book, it said that they had every Friday they had open tryouts. You could go there and try out for the fight team.
Whoa.
So somewhere along the line, after I graduated, I think I was working at Loomis at the time. I grabbed my roommate and we drove down to Northern California, and I tried out for the Frank Shamrock's fight team. And what it was just, these guys just made you do calisthenics until you were just physically couldn't do anymore. And then they just beat the shit out of you.
Like physically, like they put you in the ring?
Yeah, they get in the ring, they put a pair of gloves on you, they put you in the ring, and they're like, now it's time to spar. So, and obviously these guys are trained fighters, and you know, that had professional fights under their belt, and they would just like literally beat the shit out of you and they just wanted to see if you would give up. They're like, hey, we can teach you how to fight. They don't tell you this. They didn't tell you this in advance,
right?
But they told me this after the fact. It's like, hey, we can teach you how to fight, but we want to see if you got heart. So I did all the calisthenics, literally like burpees and squats and push-ups and sit-ups until I couldn't physically do anymore. And then they were like, okay, get some gloves on, we're going to spar. And I literally just got my ass kicked for like 35 minutes, round after round. My nose was bleeding everywhere. My eye was swollen shut. I mean, we had boxing gloves on, but these guys were just like beating the shit out of you. My leg, they had leg kicked me so much that I couldn't even walk the next day. I couldn't even like walk to the car.
But meanwhile, like you knew a thing or two about fighting because you had been doing some MMA leading up to it a bit, like, or did you are you just like cold turkey like me and PT right now? Hey, let's go down to Ken Shamrock's gym and freaking.
I mean, yeah.
Jay, let me just cut you off right there. I've worked with you so many times, and we're like pals, you know, we're buddies. And I don't think I've heard that story before.
You don't know
I've never heard that either.
Don't cut him off. I want to keep hearing this. This is an
I know, but it's just
story.
like I think it's amazing because I tell this to my friends too. Like when you know, I have some friends who are fans of the UFC, and I'm like, yeah, I work for Jason MacDonald. I'm like, you work for Jason MacDonald? Like, that's so cool. And then they tell me all these things about you, and I'm like, yeah. And then I kind of remember the really cool stories you tell me, because you tell us one probably every seminar. You just pop a new one out, but I've never heard that one. That's amazing.
Yeah,
and like I don't think people. Let's just give you a little bit more of a credit here. Like, we talk about the UFC and fighting in UFC before we get like really in depth there. I have your stats up right here. Total mixed martial art records. So total fights 41, total wins 25, by knockout only 3, but 19 submissions. So you're a submission dude. By decision 3. So I mean, like, you didn't just like fight in the UFC and then got your ass kicked and then lost your contract. Like, you had several fights, and you had a title fight against Rich Franklin and stuff like that. So like, before we go even deeper in these stories, like, I think it's cool to know that like, it's not just a dude who tried the UFC. Like, you made it in the
major
UFC.
career.
Like, major career.
I had a good run.
Run. Yeah, you're always so humble with that, but like you're one of the original like Canadian fighters too. Like, if not the original, like there's probably one guy before you that was Canadian in the UFC, right?
There is well, I mean, GSP was early on, Patrick Cote, and I think David Loiseau. I think
I remember those guys. Yeah.
In the first 5 or 6 guys that had appeared in the very first guy to appear. I mean, there was guys in those original UFCs. God, why are they escaping? Carlos Newton was a guy from Toronto. But I mean, as the sport grew and exploded, we were certainly like the first kind of handful of guys that were there when the sport was blowing up.
Yeah. So what happened at this ranch?
So
you got your ass
they-
just
yeah,
handed
they
to
did
you
that
like
to you
that.
So yeah, got my ass handed to me. There was 3 of us. The one guy didn't make it through the physical testing. The other guy made it through the physical testing and just got beat senseless and tapped out at one point, just gave up. And then I hung in there to the end. So by default, so at the end, you're just sitting there battered and bloody and beaten, and they go in the office and they come back out and they shake my hand and they're like, congratulations, you made it. You made it through the trial. And
Oh
you're
my
welcome. You're welcome to come here and train whenever
You
you
can
want.
come train with us now.
So, I mean, and I had no plan at that point. I was like, we had a new baby. Literally, we had a brand new baby. My wife and I had a brand new baby at home, probably minimal money. And so my roommate and I drove back. We were driving in his old Ford Ranger truck. And we drove back to Calgary. I worked for a number of months. That's where I was working for Loomis at the time. And I worked and saved up a bunch of money. And, well, whatever a bunch of money is when you're 24, 25 years old. And I went back down there and just showed up at Frank's door one day and was like, hey, I'm back to train. And I stayed down there for like 4 to 6 weeks. I can't remember what it was. I slept on his couch, slept on the couch. And I went to the gym. I just like followed them around like a little puppy. I just followed them around and asked questions and learned as much as I possibly could in that time. And then I came back to Canada, and then that's kind of what really kick-started fighting for me. I came back to Canada, started taking training much more serious, had some skills now that I could build on, and had exposure to guys that actually knew how to fight and knew that I really needed to improve my abilities, and that's what kind of kickstarted fighting for me.
Wow.
Yeah.
Who'd you work with in Alberta?
Oh man, back then there was like just a handful of guys that were like, you guys got to understand that MMA wasn't a thing then. Like the UFC at that point was still considered this really like barbaric. I remember one of the first UFCs that I fought in Montreal. It might have been the first one in Canada. There was headlines on the front page of the newspaper, the human cockfighting coming to Montreal. Like it was not something that was well received back then. It was like kind of like CrossFit was. I say that MMA and CrossFit are very similar because CrossFit now, like when it got exposure to television and it's become much more mainstream and popular, that's what MMA was back then. It was like, it wasn't popular. It wasn't mainstream. The only people that watched it were people that would pay $65, $70 to buy the pay-per-view. And when MMA made it to cable television, so I fought on the first UFC that was free on cable television. Anybody could tune in, and Tito, I can't remember who Tito fought. I think Tito fought Chuck Liddell in the main event. And it was live, free on television in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, at the Hard Rock. And when that happened, that kind of brought MMA. Anybody could be flicking the channels and tune into MMA and watch MMA. And the kind of the same thing happened to CrossFit, right? Like it was CrossFit.com was kind of like this website where these, it was kind of like it had a cult following. And until CrossFit was on television and people could just tune in and watch it, and there was CrossFit movies on Netflix, you guys, I'm sure you guys remember what a huge impact that had on your business when that started happening.
Yeah.
Yeah,
People
definitely.
randomly just pull up the documentary on Netflix and they're just like, hey, I watched that. It just generates like conversation where they would have never found it before.
Yeah, and the same thing, and that was the same thing for MMA. At that point,
Yeah.
when MMA really exploded, and I just happened to be involved in the sport when it was like exploding onto the mainstream. So,
Mm.
and there was very small amount of fighters then. There's so many weight classes and so many fighters nowadays that I literally have a hard time keeping track of who's who. And back then though, there was only a few weight divisions. There was like 5 weight divisions, and there was only like 10 or 15 guys fighting in each weight division. And so there was an opportunity there to kind of become a big deal, because the UFC would invest in you, and they would build you up, and you could build this very solid fan base. Nowadays, they just like, they use you and get rid of you. They use you. You put on a good fight, they keep you around for another fight, and then if you have a bad fight, they get rid of you and they bring in somebody else. Back then, there wasn't that many good fighters, great fighters. So if you had a bad fight, they would invest in you, and they would stand behind you. And as the sport evolved, like toward the end of my career, it was huge by that point. And that's what it kind of got to. I'm sure I've told Paul these stories, or you too, Pete. Like, I had a 5 or 6 fight contract, and the last fight in this contract, it was $52,000 to fight and $52,000 to win. That's how you get paid in fighting. Like, unless you're a champ. I mean, back then, anyways, you got paid to fight, paid to win. And I lost the fight, and then they cut me shortly thereafter. They said that they wanted me to go back to some of the smaller shows and get some wins, because I had lost 2 or 3 in a row. I can't remember what it was. And so I went back to these smaller shows for 6 months, and I was just kicking ass. I was fighting like crazy in all these main events of these smaller shows. And I was fighting other guys that had been cut from the UFC, and I was winning fights, and I was making good money too. I was making really solid money in these smaller shows. And finally I get the call. My manager calls me and says, "Hey, they want you back in the UFC. They want to sign you again." And I'm like, "Oh man, awesome. That's what I was working so hard for." And they sent the contract over, and they offered me $4,000 to fight and $4,000 to win.
Oh man.
They just brought you right back down to when you started.
Yeah, they just brought me right back down to the bottom, like where I started. I actually think I maybe even made a little bit more than that in my very first fight in the UFC.
You're like, guys, I've been beating the shit out of these plugs in the minor leagues, basically.
Yeah.
Like, give me something here.
Yeah, and that's what that business turned into. It turned into a business. It turned into this big business where there was guys like, "Hey, if you don't want the 4-and-4, then there's a million other. There's 75 guys in line behind you that'll take it." Yeah. And so of course I took it.
Yeah, I think like, obviously you're on here because we all met through CrossFit, so there's some parallels to be made there. But I want to know why, like, you're explaining the infancy of the UFC and how it was so small, and maybe there wasn't that much money to be made right off the bat. Like, what drew you to that, as opposed to, like, if you were a good fighter, you could have said, "Hey, I'm an athlete. I pick up things quickly. I'm a good fighter. Maybe I'll go into boxing. Maybe there's more money into that." Like, what drew you to MMA? Was it like the multidisciplinary aspect of it, just like CrossFit is, or because you're an athlete? They called you Jason the Athlete MacDonald. That was his nickname in the UFC. So, like, being an athlete, you could have just decided to pick another route in the fighting world to maybe go make more money because MMA was just starting out. I don't know. Talk about that.
Well, I think I was intrigued. I think, like everybody else, when the UFC first came out, it was like just the way it was marketed, that it was like, it really was about who was better. Like, back then, was karate better, was boxing better, was wrestling better, was jiu-jitsu better. And I think it was really like the ultimate manly thing to do. Like, it was like, hey, what is better? Who is better? You bring the best of what you got, I'll bring the best of what I got, and then, I mean, eventually, it very quickly moved away from, because guys were exposed to only having one discipline, and they were exposed to that. So very quickly, it started to morph into mixed martial arts, where it's like, hey, if you really want to be good at this sport, you got to be good at everything. You can't just, in much like CrossFit, like, hey, you can have a great weightlifter, but they're going to get exposed in the Metcon workouts. You can be great at gymnastics, you're going to get exposed. So I think it's probably always been that. That's what drew me to MMA. That's what also drew me to CrossFit, was like, hey, I don't just want to be good at weightlifting. I just don't want to be good. I don't want to be good at running 5K. I want to be good at it all. And I think that's what drew me to it. It was, and just the fact that I fucking sucked. Like, I'm not one of those guys that wants to be great at, like, well, I do want to be great at everything, but I want to earn it. Like, I fucking sucked at it. I was like, same as my first CrossFit workout. I was appalled at how unfit I was. Like, I did the filthy 50. I couldn't even finish it. And I was like, fuck, you got to be kidding me. I've been training for 10, 15 years and I can't even finish this bullshit workout. Like, I was appalled at how unfit I was. And then that's what hooked me. Like, I was like, I want to get good at it. I want to get good at this. And I know it's going to require a lot of work and it's going to require a lot of time, but I want to get good at this. And I think fighting was the same. I sucked. I realized how bad I sucked when I got my ass handed to me for 25 minutes, 35 minutes, whatever it was, in rocks. And I was like, I suck at this and I want to get better. It was like, I guess maybe just, the desire to be better and to be a student. I love being a student. I love learning new shit.
Something you, oh, sorry, go ahead, Pete.
I was going to say, when in your career did you find CrossFit? Like, you said you were training for 15 years. Was it like you had been fighting for a long time and then you found it?
I've been fighting for a while. I don't know if I'd been fighting for a long time. Man, I can remember just like yesterday doing that workout, but I can't remember exactly when it was. What I'll tell you is I didn't even have a computer because I had to look it up at the gym there was a gym computer on the counter. I didn't even own a computer at the time.
Were you fighting in the UFC or in the?
I don't think I was no, I definitely was not in the UFC at that point. Or maybe it was right around the same time. I think up until that point, I was doing I wasn't doing conventional training because I realized that just running wasn't enough, and I realized that just doing bodybuilding exercises wasn't enough. I was doing more of like a glorified boot camp kind of program at that point.
Jason, you said something there that made me think of something. So since we're really good friends, we talk to each other all the time, and doing this podcast is like not awkward, but like, I'm asking some questions
you know the
I know
answer to.
Questions I know the answer to and stuff. And like, so right before the podcast, we have a good buddy of ours, Glenn Cameron, who's a huge UFC fan. And I sent him a message. I'm like, if you could ask Jason 4 questions about anything, UFC, CrossFit, whatever you want, what would they be? So I wrote them down here, and I don't know if we'll get to all of them because I think these could turn into an entire podcast in themselves. But when you talk about loving MMA, being attracted to MMA and being attracted to CrossFit for kind of the same reasons, one of his questions was, is there one CrossFit workout you've done that comes close to a fight you've been in?
That's a good question.
Well,
you said you would say fight gone bad.
No, because the thing about a fight is like you can't control the pace of a fight. Like your opponent workout, you can take a break. If you're doing a workout, just take a break. At any point, you check out.
You're
course
cutting
you-
out. Are you kidding?
Like,
Are you guys seeing this? He's cutting out.
Yeah,
Okay, are you back?
you're back. You're back. You're back.
Tell your
Okay.
kids to stop playing Fortnite. Get off the network.
True. My kids are doing schoolwork. So my internet is highly busy right now.
You got cut off like right when you were starting to answer that. So restart.
So the one thing that you can't control in a fight is the other guy, right? So he's the unknown factor in a fight. So in a workout, if you want to take a break, you take a break. I mean, your inner bitch is telling you not to take breaks, right? Or your inner bitch is telling you to take more breaks. But you're always fighting that it's in your head. But in the ring, you're fighting the other guy. He's the one, like, he has a say in how the pace of the fight. So I don't think you can really draw parallels as far as like, does a workout compare to a fight? Well, there's lots of fights that really sucked, and there's lots of workouts that really sucked. But
so maybe let's because obviously a fight is different than workout for sure. Like when you're in a workout, you're not afraid of dying per se, right? But like, is there a moment or in a fight where you've been so physically exhausted that you couldn't keep going, or like that you finished the fight and you knocked the guy out and you submitted him and you were just like, that was the hardest fight I've ever done? And in that moment, is there a parallel to be made with like the hardest workout you've ever done?
No. We can't draw a connection that's not there. Like, I've been in fights where I've been just like beaten and battered and tired and both won and lost. But usually the only thing you feel then is just either the disappointment of losing or the excitement of winning. You can't relate to how tired you are. And I mean, mid-fight, it's no different than mid-workout. You're telling yourself not to quit. You're telling yourself to keep pushing. There's constantly that inner conversation in your head, even mid-fight, not as, like as the fight's happening, that conversation is happening in your head.
Yeah,
That's cool.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So Jay, you're talking to three guys right now that are new fathers, right? Compared to you, because you have 4 kids and your kids are 18, 16, I think 13 and 11.
Close. 21, 18.
Oh,
Tristan's 21. Tristan's going into
that's right. Man, time flies.
4th year university. Keel is 18, and he's his first year out of high school. He's getting into a paramedic. He's taking being a paramedic. Jed is 14 and True is 12.
Okay. So, needless to say, you were fighting in the UFC, and you had 4 kids. So you were training full time, and you were a father of 4, right? So,
and at that point, you had a gym, and you were on
You must
seminar
have a
staff.
rock star wife.
I do have a rock star wife. We also, in all fairness, we also had a live-in nanny. So that was very helpful. We had a live-in nanny who really, without her, we probably would have never. And she was with us for a long time. She was with us for many years, and she even lived with us for a couple of years after our kids were like grown up and in school. She just became a part of our family.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, because I always find it interesting when you talk about the UFC and your times fighting where it was really a job, and often we talk about that you fought to survive, and you fought to stay in the UFC because those paychecks were important because for your family. And I always find that inspiring that you talk about fighting to put food on the table, and people that don't know you're an extremely smart guy. You're a flow master on staff, and you're not just some bozo, who knew how to fight, who went into the ring, and that's kind of the image that maybe at the beginning that's what we had of the UFC. But I mean, so talk about like training full time as a professional athlete to try and put food on the table for your 4 kids. Like that's huge.
Yeah, I mean, that was my job. My job was a professional fighter. I had no other, I mean, yeah, I had a gym, but you guys remember in the early days, like my gym was just making enough money to survive. My, my gym originally only survived because I was teaching mixed martial arts. Mixed martial arts was carrying the CrossFit program. For a lot of years, that was the case, that the MMA program that I was teaching every night was carrying the, the CrossFit program. But yeah, it was my job. I would get up in the morning. I live in Red Deer, which is halfway between Edmonton. And so it's an hour and 15 minutes from Edmonton, an hour and 15 minutes from Calgary. And I would get up in the morning. I would drive to Edmonton to box. I would box. I can't remember if I did CrossFit first and then boxed, or if I boxed and then did CrossFit. I think I'd stopped at the CrossFit gym. So I bought a membership at a CrossFit gym up there called Spark. And I started CrossFitting. And so I'd go do strength and conditioning. Then I would go over to the boxing gym. You want to get good at something, you have to find people that are better than you. And so I trained at a boxing gym where there was a bunch of professional boxers, and those guys loved nothing more than to beat the shit out of me because I was an MMA guy, and they wanted to show me who was boss. And but eventually I got much better at boxing, and eventually, not very often, but every once in a while I would get the better of them. And so I would go up there, train with the boxers, and then I would drive back home, get some lunch, and rest a bit, and then I would drive to Calgary, where my MMA coach and jiu-jitsu coach was, and I would train there, and then I would drive back home and teach classes, MMA classes, all night at my gym. And if I was training for a fight, I would make that kind of quasi teaching class, but also my own training. So. And that's what I did day in and day out. Monday to Friday, I would do that. And Monday to Saturday, I would always drive down to Calgary on Saturdays and do open mat at the jiu-jitsu club. It was a job. That's what I did. And my wife, that was our form of income, And so the shitty thing about fighting is
it's not like a paycheck every week.
Yeah, you make money, and sometimes it was like you make a large amount of money, and you'd be like, "Oh shit, man, I got a lot of money. I just made $60,000," but you would never know when you would fight again. Like there was no consistent paycheck. So, like everybody else, we had vehicles and we had bills and we had a mortgage. And so you would just have to put that money in the bank. And like I said, we had a nanny, we'd have to pay our nanny, and you just kind of live off that money. And it was, you would watch your bank account dwindle and dwindle, and you'd be like, fuck, I hope I get a fight soon. And you would be going through a fight, and, I don't know how many times in training camps where I remember this one training camp, I was like 3 weeks out from the fight, and I was wrestling in Edmonton with a wrestler from U of A, University of Alberta. And he was shot in to take me down, and he threw his head up and he hit me on the eye. And I got 7 stitches in my eye. Well, I was 3 weeks out from a fight. I was broke. I had no money left. I had to fight. So I remember showing up at the UFC, like wearing a toque pulled down on my eye, like pulled down low so nobody would see these 5 or 7 stitches in my eye. Like you just had to do shit like that. Or, you were busted up and banged up and broken, and you had to fight because that was the only way. You had to make it through to the fight, and you had to fight because it was the only way you're going to pay your bills, feed your family.
So that's obviously a huge reason why you've got so many professional fights, is because you just had to continue on. Like because we had a conversation the other day about the current state of the UFC is it's less about bringing guys up from the minor leagues or the minor shows, and more about these like big mega training gyms where guys are less doing these other shows, and they'll just like handpick a guy from a training facility, and they'll have like, 5 or 6 fights. Whereas, what was the number you said, PT? How many fights does he have?
41, not in the UFC though, but 41 professional mixed martial arts fights.
Right. So that's got to be a huge reason, right? That you just continued to do the fights, was just to keep getting paychecks.
I mean, at a certain point, you just gotta, you guys know how that goes. You just have to do what you have to do. And there was, even towards the end when I retired, I probably was just fighting for the sake of just paying my bills at that point, because I had lost the desire. That's what led to me retiring. I still had fights left in my contract. I didn't retire because I got cut, and I retired with fights left in my contract because I didn't want to fight anymore. I was done grinding. I was working on seminar staff. The gym had, so I stopped teaching MMA at that point and just only had a CrossFit gym. And the gym started to make revenue, and I was working on seminar staff, and I realized that I didn't want to fight for $6,000 anymore. Like put in 3 months of hard work to possibly make $6,000. And really, if I put in that amount of work and anything else in my life, I say this all the time, I probably could have picked bottles for 3 months and made the same amount of money at that point. Like, and then you take a step back and you start to look at it like, why am I doing this? I've got I think I actually have more fights than that. I think I have over 50 fights. I think there's fights on there that were amateur fights.
Wikipedia.
And you're like, well, why am I fighting? I got nothing to prove. Like, I'm not trying to prove. I didn't start fighting because I wanted to prove that I was some tough guy. I started fighting because I sucked at it and I wanted to get better. And then after a while, you start to be like, well, now I'm no longer fighting to pay my bills. I've opened up other sources of revenue and looked at moving into the next phase of my life. Why am I fighting? And that was a serious, hard conversation that I had with myself for probably months, back and forth in your head. And finally it just led to one day I remember as plain as day, we were at swimming lessons, watching one of the kids at swimming lessons. And I looked over at my wife, Kelly, and I was like, do you think I'm ever going to fight again? And she goes, no, I don't think so. And I literally took my cell phone out of my pocket and I called Dana White and I told him that I was done fighting. I was like,
wow.
No shit.
I was like, I appreciate everything you guys have done for me. I had a great run in the UFC, but I'm done. I'm done fighting. And that was the end of it.
That's cool.
See, that's another one I've never heard. Jeez, you're full of them.
That was the end of it. It was done. They sent me like a contract the next day, like saying that I was officially retired and that if I ever chose to fight again, I'd have to fulfill my obligations to them. But that was it. It was over. That was the end of it. That.
You're a pretty OG in the UFC, like in terms of when the UFC got popular and stuff. And I find now the UFC is kind of evolving into like more drama and more like antics and shit. I just want to get your take on that because you seem like a pretty straight up, I don't know you as well as the boys do, but you seem like a pretty straight up dude. You're like fighting to put food on the table and stuff. And I just feel like what the UFC has become and where it's going is more of like it's like a parody with dramatics and all this bullshit. Like, I just want to hear your like, how do you feel about all that? Because I feel like it wasn't like that when you were in it, or maybe you were starting to get like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think drama makes money. There was always some behind the scenes drama. There was always a few people. There was very few guys that I fought that I actually didn't like. Like, fighting was the sport, it was just a sport. I didn't look at it as a violence thing. It wasn't like about violence. It was the sport. The sport just happened to be beating the shit out of each other. But there wasn't many guys that I fought that I didn't like. And I'd say back then when the UFC there was a small amount of guys and there was a lot of guys training with other guys. And you would go train with these guys knowing that you might possibly have to fight those guys down the road. so there wasn't as much drama back then. It was nowadays, I think there's a lot more fights. There's a lot more fights. There's a lot more fighters. And I think that drama sells fights. So if they want to there's the market's so saturated with fights. If they really want to build a fight up and make money off it, there has to be like a backstory. There has to be drama. And nobody's better at that than McGregor, right? Like McGregor can fucking fight. He's a great fighter, but he can also sell a fight, right? Like nobody can sell a fight like him. And so I don't know that there is as much of that drama as they play it up to be. Like I think behind the scenes, there's probably not that much drama. It's kind of like watching the new CrossFit movie where, you know, they just like, they make drama that's not really there by cutting and pasting little clips of, you know, you can cut and paste a little clip of someone saying something and put it and place it in the right place of a movie and make it look like there's a lot of drama.
Big time.
I'll give you some drama. I'll give you some drama. How about this, Jason? Some guy gets cut from the Ultimate Fighter show and then submits both the winners following the TV show. How about that? Tell me about that.
They won the show. I submitted them.
So that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. And you know what? That's one of Glenn's questions. What was the feeling like storming the UFC scene as a relative unknown, beating Chris Lieben and Ed Herman, who were popular from the TV show? And you've told me this story before, a couple times actually. I love the story. Both by submission, collecting 2-time submission of the night bonuses back to back. What did you do with that bonus money?
Man.
But talk about that first.
Well, I mean, that whole, so I was brought into the UFC at that, when I was brought, like nobody will deny this, I wouldn't deny it either. I was doing pretty well in the small shows. And, but they brought me in as a stepping stone for Ed Herman. So Ed Herman just came off the first Ultimate Fighter. And he was the runner-up. He lost to Kendall Grove. Or I can't remember how that all unfolded. Like, but they were trying to build him up. He was a big deal. He had just came out of the television show, and he was a big deal. They were going to build him up, and they brought me in there. They had to give him an opponent that was like not a complete tomato can. Because if they gave him a complete tomato can, it just didn't give any, you know, credibility to him winning the fight. So I had a pretty solid record in these smaller shows, and they brought me in there just as a stepping stone for Ed Herman. But it just doesn't always work that way. You don't always get this, it just doesn't always work that way.
There's that quote. Remember the quote that I sent a bunch of the guys, including you. Remember I found those videos of you in the UFC, and then there's a quote. It's like of you on TV. Rez, you're talking about drama. Jason had a little drama.
Yeah.
He was interviewed, and he was like, "I ain't no stepping stone."
Yeah, that was Joe Rogan interviewing me, and that wasn't like anything scripted. I didn't know I was going to have to do an interview on live television, you know, but they brought me in there as a stepping stone, and I was like, man, I've like put too much into this, and I've worked too hard to just be this guy's stepping stone. Like, and I knew I was a better fighter. Of course, he probably thought he was a better fighter, right? Like, yeah. But so on that night, it was a pretty short, easy fight actually. I choked him out. I submitted him with a triangle, and then what happened was they weren't anticipating me winning that fight. It was like really mixed things up, and they were like, well, "Wait a sec, he just went in here and made short work of this guy." So there was a little hype maybe around me, and then they had this big New Year's show. Every year they put on a show, a UFC in Vegas, and it's like the end of the year show, the big show. And another kind of side story that was going on was they were trying to figure out who was going to be the number one contender to fight for the middleweight title. And they had kind of built it up that they wanted Chris Lieben to be this guy. He was like this tough as nails.
I hated that guy.
Yeah,
I
I
watched
mean,
that
but
show.
you
Huge
can't
bitch.
deny how tough that guy was. Like, he was tough as nails. And so they built it up that they wanted him to be the next contender. And of course, they had to get him a fight on this big card. And what better guy to fight him than me, who had just kind of upset his teammate. Ed Herman was his teammate. And I had a little bit of hype because I upset Ed Herman pretty quickly. And what better guy to fight him than me? Again, thinking that I was going to be a stepping stone. They were just going to use me to kind of build up Chris Lieben. And again, I I had a different feeling.
Was it
So
triangle?
I was there on this big New Year's show.
Guilty.
And choked him out. But I mean, I took a savage fucking beating. The guy beat me senseless. Like, for weeks afterwards, my head hurt. Like, I had bumps on my head. Like, I took a savage beating at the hands of this guy, but eventually I choked him out. I choked him
hung in
unconscious.
there. Yeah.
Unconscious too. He wouldn't tap. This guy was so tough that he wouldn't tap. I choked him on television, like live on pay-per-view. I choked him unconscious.
Love that.
So Jason, yeah.
I want to watch that right now.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, man, like when you talk about, the beginning, and you basically have to win these fights to still be on there. Like, the amount of pressure that you must feel, like,
is that you? I can't hear you. Is my internet or your internet?
No. Hello? Can you hear me?
Still can't hear you. Petey, you talk.
Can you hear me?
I can't hear anybody.
I can hear everyone.
I can hear everyone.
Okay, sorry. There we go. It's back.
Yeah.
Okay, it's back.
I was just saying, like, the amount of pressure and just, like, nerves that you have for, like, days, weeks, months leading up to the fight. Like, I think of a CrossFit competition, like the nerves that we have with that, and it's just like, I know we've talked about this before. We're like, how do you sleep at night thinking that, like, your entire career relies on beating up another guy or not getting beat up by another guy?
Well, I think early, in the end, that was like one of the big reasons for deciding to retire. I didn't want that stress anymore. That stress is such a huge burden, man. And maybe when I was younger and early in my career, I embraced that a little more. But when I got later in my career, man, I just was done with that stress of, like, just constantly on your mind, day in and day out, just running through every scenario possible. Like, and then the stress in that final week of making weight. And then, walking out, the worst is walking out in front of 50,000 people, standing behind a curtain with a television camera in your face and someone counting down, like, in 3, 2, 1, and they open the curtain and you get, 30 to 50,000 people going crazy.
That's
like, so here's the next question then. Here's another one that Glenn asked.
It's like one of the biggest UFC fights in history, like attendance-wise, right?
Yeah, the UFC Toronto was, at the time it was the biggest. It's been surpassed, I think, by Madison Square Garden.
Loudest building you've ever fought in? UFC 83 in Montreal, UFC 72 in Belfast, or UFC 129 in Toronto?
The 83 in Montreal, it was so loud. They were yelling so loud at the end when I knocked out Joe Dirksen that it was hurting my ears. I can still remember how loud they were screaming. It was like literally hurting my ears. They were screaming so loud in Montreal.
That's amazing.
Without a doubt, Montreal was the loudest ever.
What's his fourth question?
Bonus that night?
The bonuses were the Chris Lieben and Ed Herman fights.
You got a good bonus for Dirksen too, though, right?
I got a big bonus for
75K, I believe.
75K.
Oh,
those are when you get a check for 75 grand, that's like, you're like, and back then there was like, they just, it was very arbitrary. They just like, it was whatever Dana wanted to do. So
No way, he just throws it
you're
out.
just sitting in the locker room, you're waiting for the press conference to happen, because he would usually just arbitrarily announce it at the press conference. You're like, you're just
Fingers
hoping.
crossed. Yeah.
You're just fingers crossed. You're like, did I get it? Did I get it? I think I was back at the hotel before I realized that I got it that night. That was one of the few fights that I didn't like the guy. You guys have all heard this story. Like, I did not like Joe Dirksen. So Joe Dirksen and I had some history. We fought on a show, a smaller show in his city. His trainer, his coach's trainer put on this fight card in Winnipeg. And Joe and I were slotted to fight in the main event. And Joe was a jiu-jitsu guy as well. So it was kind of a big fight on the Canada scene. And Joe Dirksen was a jiu-jitsu black belt, and he had already fought in the UFC at that point, but he had got cut. And so him and I were fighting in a smaller show. And there was just a lot of back and forth banter between him and I. And long story short is I beat him. I beat his ass. I choked him out, but before choking him out, I fucking beat him up. He had a huge cut in his forehead from an elbow. I threw an elbow and like literally just split his forehead from top of his nose to the top of his forehead. There was blood everywhere. It went on for 4 or 5 rounds. It was a title fight. And anyways, at the end, I choked him out. I think I finished him in a rear naked choke. And so he claimed after the fight that the only reason I beat him was because I cut him. He said that the cut was what changed. Well, I'm like, well, yeah, but that's fighting. That's the way it goes. You're right.
Deal with it, yeah.
I elbowed you in the face and cut you. And sure, that cut probably had a huge effect on the outcome of the fight. But and back then there was like these message boards. There was this one place, like the Underground, it was called. And this is where all fighters and fight fans it was their only way of communicating. And there was always this ongoing rift between him and I that he claimed that I only beat him because I cut him.
Rez, this is the drama you were looking for.
Exactly.
So,
it's always
drama. There's always
there.
drama.
It's always been there.
So anyways, fast forward a bunch of years or a couple of years, Joe Dirksen got back into the UFC. I was fighting in the UFC at the time. And I don't know, I was maybe like 5 or 6 fights in, and I was doing pretty well and had a pretty solid name and a solid fan base. And he fought his way back into the UFC, and he took a short notice fight. And this is the story I've been told. I've never confirmed this was Joe, but he took a short notice fight for them, and they said that they would, if he took the fight on short notice, they would do whatever he wanted for them. And he said, well, what I want a rematch with Jason MacDonald. So the rematch was Joe and I fighting in the UFC. And so it was the first fight in Montreal. There was so much hype around the fight. I told you it was like on the front page of all the papers. It sold out in minutes. Like it sold out the Bell Center in just a matter of minutes. And it was just crazy in there that night. And fast forward, I knocked Joe out. I knocked him out. I knocked him out with an elbow again on the ground, the same way I cut him the first time. And in fact, I knocked him out, and he was
on the front of the forehead.
Right. Yeah, I was elbowing him in the face, and he got knocked out.
Wow.
And I looked at the referee to say like, hey, he's out. And the referee is like, keep going. So I keep elbowing him. And this happens very fast. And every time I elbow him, I can see it's just cutting him. Every elbow is cutting his face up like crazy, to the point when finally the ref steps in and stops the fight. So in my opinion, and to this day, I still believe that he took probably 5 to 7 unnecessary elbows to the face because the referee didn't stop the fight when he should have. And I remember like leaving the ring, and other fighters were like in backstage, other fighters were like choked at me. They're like, why were you still hitting him? And I'm like, well, I mean, the referee was telling me to keep going, like, or like he was clearly unconscious and you elbowed him 5 times in the face. I'm like, yeah, that did happen.
I mean, that happens I see highlights and stuff that happens in the UFC. Like you can see the guy's done and the ref waits a little bit, maybe a little bit too long, but
quickly.
Yeah, it's
But
like 3 seconds. You lace out 5 elbows. Like
that's right. Yeah. So that was one of the few fights that I really didn't like the guy. Like him and I had a lot of like previous history where we did not like each other. And if now if I seen Joe, I would shake his hand, and I think things are cool between us now. But back then, things were certainly not cool between us.
Are you gonna ask him the last question, PT?
Yeah, I could.
Uh-oh.
What was going through your mind at UFC 68 after you entered the cage with Rich Franklin's music? You entered the cage and Rich Franklin's music hit for him to come on in his home state of Ohio.
Well, I was just shitting my pants from I think the moment I signed that fight, I signed the dotted line to take that fight. I think I was in a state of shitting my pants. Like, because what happened was, like I told you, if we go back a little bit, the big build-up, the backstory was that they wanted Chris Lieben to fight Rich Franklin.
Oh, okay. And
they didn't anticipate me beating Chris Lieben. So Dana White had already announced the winner of the Lieben-MacDonald fight was going to fight Franklin. And obviously, I don't even think I knew that. I don't think that I knew that at the time. But obviously, I beat Lieben, and that immediately put me, within days after the Lieben fight, they signed me to fight. They announced that I was going to fight Franklin. So here I am, 3 fights into the UFC. I'm in my 3rd UFC fight, and I'm fighting, at that time, who was a guy that I idolized. It was a complete badass, was just messing people up. And here we are at, headlining a UFC against Rich Franklin, man. I prepared the best I could for that fight, but to say that I had any confidence that I was ever going to win that fight would be an exaggeration. It would be a stretch. I mean, of course, at the time, I had myself convinced I could win the fight, and I prepared the best I could and put together the best game plan that we could to win that fight. Obviously, I spent the night in the hospital, so I wasn't able to. I obviously didn't execute the plan as well as.
Was that the fight? Was that the fight where the next day you saw Arnold Schwarzenegger?
That was, yeah, the next day. So back then, at the Arnold Classic, they ran a big UFC event together with the Arnold Classic, and so obviously Arnold was there for the Arnold Classic, and I went to Starbucks. You guys know this story.
This is funny to tell it.
Great story.
There's the Starbucks that was across the street from the hotel, and I woke up the next morning, and I was literally, both of my eyes were literally swollen shut. They were they were just like little slits that I could see out of. My face was just black and blue and swollen. And my wife and I went over to Starbucks, and we're standing in Starbucks, just her and I. And all of a sudden, all these black Suburbans pull up outside of Starbucks, and the Secret Service guys come in, just like in the movies, in their black suits with their black ties and their glasses on. And they kind of set up a perimeter, and in strolls Arnold. He was the governor. He was the governor then. And I was standing putting milk or sugar in my coffee at that point. And Arnold walks by me, he stops, and he comes back, and he's like, obviously looks at me, and he's like, I watched you fight last night. You were up, you were down. He was just, and he shook my hand, we got a picture. We got a picture with Arnold, and yeah, it was cool. It was pretty cool.
You were up, you were down, good fight.
That's exactly how he talked too. That was exactly how he talked.
That's amazing.
So,
Oh man, that's great.
that's the fight career. That was, I mean, obviously I could tell you guys a million
A
stories
million
like
stories.
that,
We could
right?
talk for hours.
Like I could, there's, every fight had its own kind of backstory, and I remember different fights for different reasons, and you guys mentioned going to Ireland. Like at one point, PT, you mentioned the Ireland fight. Like I remember that first ever fight in Ireland, in Belfast, and back then, like Belfast was still like there. It was still a bit sketchy, and it was just. I can remember every fight, and I remember we went out after that fight, and we passed out in the lobby of the hotel. I woke up the next morning. We were like laying on couches my trainer and I in the lobby of the hotel. Like you just remember every fight has a crazy, funny backstory.
Before we wrap it up, we should probably we gotta have you on for like a part 2 because we could go on forever. But we'll do a part 2 at one point
because we haven't even talked about CrossFit.
I know we haven't even talked about
I got some
CrossFit.
equally entertaining CrossFit stories.
Exactly. So we'll come back and talk about CrossFit. But before we go, since we're on the MMA train, what do you think about Dana White buying an island during
Mortal
COVID?
Kombat.
Yeah, he's gonna buy an island. Do you hear this, PT?
Yeah.
And he's gonna run fights on the island.
Well, fuck the show. I read it today. I mean, just like you guys, I read it today. I guess when you're talking about, you're talking about shutting down a multi-million-dollar business. Like he's just looking for ways. So I guess from his standpoint, hey, if not having fight cards costs me $100 million or $50 million, well then fuck it. I'll just go buy an island for $60 million and the show will go on.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have that kind of capital and that kind of money to do it, then I say, fuck it, do it. It's.
Well, I'll tell you right now, I'm going to tune in because it's the only sport on TV.
Who's not going to tune in?
I know.
Yeah, exactly.
What else is going on right now? Like,
there's literally nothing.
And the worst case scenario is he owns an island after it's all.
Yeah, exactly. If they can figure out a way to run the CrossFit Games, it would be the second most viewed sport.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I think we got to talk about what's going on in the world though before we sign out here. Like, how long can they keep the world on lockdown before everything just falls apart?
Oh man.
So June 30th for us, at least.
Yeah, they set a date in Ontario for the city of Ottawa facilities and all that. June 30th is.
That's what they said here as well, June 30th. But think, guys, we're sitting at April 7th. We've been on lockdown for just about a month.
It's the fourth week.
Yeah,
we're starting the fourth week here in Ottawa.
The fourth week, so we're still 2.5 months away from there. Right? Like, what?
Look, I mean, how's your gym reacting to it? Like, what does that mean for you?
I mean,
like, how's it going in Red Deer?
I mean, right now, from a gym perspective, I mean, like you guys, I have awesome members, and a majority of those members have kind of made a decision that they're going to stand by their gym. We've reduced everybody's memberships down to almost half of what they were. We've given every single bit of equipment that was at the gym. The gym is just sitting there empty. And we continue to post workouts. And I, for the most part, I think people right now, like we're talking 1 month in, people are still pretty supportive. And we've received tons of emails that are like, hey, our membership's we want you to keep our membership going. But I don't know what that will look like 3 months from now.
No, yeah.
Like, are they willing to do that? Like, I would never expect any of my members to continue their membership going if they're struggling to pay their own bills.
We've basically come to terms with the fact that we have to run an online business and come up with new membership options for a new service and try and, over the course of what we have been up until this point, trying to optimize what it is that we do for sort of the online version, you know. And because you're right, like the longer it goes on, at one point, like you gotta start making money, and you need to, if you're a CrossFit gym owner and this is, you know, for us, this is our careers, then how are we going to make that happen while we're stuck at home, basically, you know? Because you're right, it works for your members who continue paying that membership out of the good of their hearts. It only works for so long.
It only works for so long. So, I mean, for us right now is, you know, our business, you know, is it's still there. It's still, our clientele base is there. Obviously we've had some of our bills deferred like most people have. And we didn't rely on the gym. My wife and I didn't rely on the gym as our form of income. So from that standpoint, we're okay. But man, I just don't, and an online program for me, and I'm only speaking for myself, there's so many variables there where for me to put together an online program for you is dependent on you having equipment. So like I can't charge you money for individual programming if you don't have, you know, a barbell or anything at home. I can't, you know, so I'm kind of at a spot with the whole online programming thing where they're like, oh, you just turn everything into an individual one-on-one online programming. And I'm like, well, that's just not going to work for my gym.
I actually haven't heard of that. You heard of people like gyms doing that?
Well, I hear a lot of people talking about like, hey, we're going to make it, well, you just said it, Pete. You said we're going to make it an online programming.
Yeah. It's just our program's online with 3 different options, and we give people, you know, various ways of modifying the workouts, and we have virtual classes. I think that's what we mean by online. Yeah. It's not necessarily like, it's not individualized, because you're, like you say, like that's very, very hard to do. But, you know, We'll do a workout brief every day, and we'll post that to our members, and then we'll give them different options on how to do the workout if you have this equipment or this equipment. And just like you, like all your members have your equipment. So, I mean, you kind of know what kind of inventory they're working with.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess based on that, we're doing an online program where we're writing programming. I've been writing some good workouts. Like the feedback from our community is it's like, fuck, these workouts are hard. I may not be maximizing my deadlift right now and PRing my snatch, but I'm not getting any less fit.
Not getting worse at burpees.
No.
I'm not, you know, what about those
and guess what?
ab mat sit-ups? You've been doing those?
Dude, I spent so much time on my GHD, you wouldn't think it. You wouldn't think it.
So, I mean, you know, even beyond our businesses though, we run strong affiliates, and our affiliates, your affiliate, my affiliate, will be fine. It's, you know, it's like, but just life in general, like at what point, you know, like
Jen and I were talking about this yesterday. We were like, is our child going to grow up like only ever having seen his own parents for like the first like half year to year of his life? You know, like, is that weird for his development?
They don't care,
like, so weird. You know what I mean though? Like, it's not normal to only ever have been held by just your parents for a full year of your life. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know, like, it's just, I don't mean to offend any. Well, fuck, I don't care if I offend anyone. But at what point do we just let the strong out and understand that the weak are the ones that are at risk? And I have an elderly grandmother that's still alive, and I understand that she's at risk more than anybody else. But do we lock up 80% of society?
Yeah. What you're saying, Jason, is impossible in practice because it's based on people's judgment. So it's like, it'd be really nice, Jason, if the government would say, hey, we're encouraging you guys to practice social distancing, but use your judgment. If they say that, it's over. You know, so it's like, it's basically everyone is in the same boat, and that's,
No,
that's the way it is.
that's not what I'm saying though. I'm saying like you have to lock down the extended care facilities, but I think you let
He
flattening
just wants
the
to do
curve.
normal life.
I think we have to live normal lives, and we at least we have to get slowly, and by slowly I don't mean like sometime in September. I mean like we have to open the taps back up and let people get back to normal life. And yes, are some people going to die? Sure they are. But right now they're flattening the curve to a point where not enough people are getting sick. Like,
Yeah, there's so many other factors that come into play too, like with the I totally understand your point, and to some degree I agree with you, but then there's stuff that we don't understand, which is the level of secondary death that comes from loading up the hospital with every bed, and then the people that have diseases or genetic diseases or disorders or things that they need to go to the hospital for, that they can't get the proper care, and then they start dying, so then everything is like doubled, and then and then the load on the healthcare system gets out of control, and then we start paying all this money instead of back into our economy for our small businesses to pay their employees and not fire them. It's more taxes, because now we need to start to fund the healthcare system that got totally fucked. So there's definitely a balance. And I think what we're going to see is, I'm just basing this off of like the Spanish flu, because it's the same type of virus. Is the Spanish flu had 3 like major waves. It had a huge wave up, it came back down, everyone went back to normal life. And then the second wave was like the most deadly in the US. And then it went down and it came up for a third one. And I think like by the time the second and third wave come up, I think we're going to have like a better understanding of everything. I think the parameters in place are going to be, we're going to have better systems in place for dealing with it, because it just like hit us up top the side of the head and just caught us off guard almost, so it's like everyone panics and makes all these decisions to try and deal with it, almost not really knowing what the outcomes are, but you need to do something.
Yeah, but I hear what you're saying, but and how long do you keep everything like this before, like, I'm not talking about CrossFit gyms, I'm talking about the local shawarma restaurant and the local barbershop and the local burrito place and how long before?
I need the barbershop to get back to business.
Dude, I did it myself. Look at this. Not good. But how long before these?
Or even like food shortages. Like, I think there's going to be a food shortage at one point.
Well, but how long before these places are just like 50 to 50% of these businesses go under, and then all the money that we're pumping out, like our government's pumping out in relief funds, where we just, as a society, can't recover from it.
Yeah, then it's just all gone.
It's just all compounded.
Yeah, I feel like our taxes are going to skyrocket after all this is said and done.
Yeah, like, and I get the flip side of it is some people are going to have to die. Like, and that's what's going to have to happen. Like, but I don't know if you can literally keep the world locked down for 3 more months to the point where we just can't recover from it.
We'll be able to recover from it.
You're the business guy. You think we can bounce back?
I think Canada's in a good spot.
Yeah, I think we'll be okay. It's gonna really hurt, and it's gonna spread over years probably, but and it's probably gonna be worse than the Great Depression. But and like you said, Rez, like taxes are gonna go up. Yeah, probably. Highest taxes have ever been is after the Second World War, when we had to rebuild the entire world. So, I mean, if we have to pump more money into the economy, or the governments have to, then yeah, sure. I mean, but we'll recover. We'll be fine.
There we go.
Felix, what with me?
We can't hear you because PT's headphones are in.
Oh,
Yeah. No, I see what you're saying, Jay. And like, I don't know. I think the other thing too is you listen to all these experts talking about what's going on, like not just the political and economical experts, but the disease experts and the scientists, and they all talk about trying to get ahead of it so it doesn't become like an ongoing thing, you know? And
well,
to
let's get it
me in
straight.
my head, it's like, what's
You're
that?
the only one that listens to all that bullshit, not me. I don't waste any time in my day.
I
How much
listen
time
to it
do you
all.
waste? PT, do you listen to all these experts?
I try and listen to experts who gather the information from experts and simplify
So you
it.
listen to Pete. So you listen to Pete.
I don't listen to him anymore, but I spent like a good solid 2 months.
Hey Pete, how's your sleep coach feel about you spending all your time listening to experts when it's
Dude,
cutting into your sleep?
I'll tell you right now, it's looking really good by the end of this week.
Dude, my back hurts so much from laying in bed. like every morning I'm like, Jesus, my back hurts. It's from laying in bed for 10, 11 hours a night.
For too long. Oh man. Okay.
All right, gents.
Thanks
let's
for coming
do this
on,
again.
Jay. We'll do a part
Thanks a lot,
2,
man.
and we'll talk more about CrossFit.
Why don't you guys just make me like a regular? Can I be like the fourth guy? 3 is an uneven number. Just put me the 4th guy.
That's a great idea.
We'll just toss you back on, not like the NCR podcast with Jason about Jason MacDonald. We'll just make another one. We'll talk about coaching and owning an affiliate, and we'll have you on.
Yeah.
Love it.
Right.
He doesn't like the idea of making
just
me
a resident, a resident.
No. You can be a regular.
Okay.
Well, look, I mean, yeah. See you later.
Hey, you go do some sit-ups.
I will.